5 men froze to death inside a tiny tent in Antarctica, just 11 miles away from a depot filled with food and fuel. They were not amateurs, they were national heroes. This tragedy happened because of a race between two massive egos at the bottom of the world. On one side was the British Empire, trusting in motors and ponies. On the other side was a team of Vikings, trusting in dogs and fur. This is the story of the race to the South Pole. It is a story about the difference between being brave and being prepared, and how a single decision about what to wear and what to eat determined who lived and who died in the coldest place on Earth. This story is 8 chapters long, spanning thousands of miles of ice, and it reveals the brutal truth of survival. Chapter 1. To understand why men would risk their lives to walk to the most useless spot on the planet, you have to look at the map of the world in 1909. For centuries, explorers had been filling in the blank spaces. They had found the source of the Nile, mapped the Amazon, and crossed the Australian deserts. There were only 2 big prizes left, the North Pole and the South Pole. Robert Falcon Scott was a captain in the British Royal Navy and a celebrity in England. He had already been to Antarctica once, and he was preparing a massive expedition to finally plant the British flag at the South Pole. He viewed this as his property. The British Empire felt they owned the right to be there first. Scott was raising money, hiring scientists, and preparing for a journey that was as much about science and imperial glory as it was about exploration. But secretly, in the frozen fjords of Norway, another man was watching. Roald Amundsen was a very different kind of explorer. He was obsessed with the polar regions. He had spent his life training to survive in the cold. He slept with the windows open in the Norwegian winter to toughen his body. Amundsen had originally planned to go to the North Pole. He had borrowed a famous ship, the Fram, and was preparing to drift across the Arctic Ocean. But just as he was getting ready to leave, breaking news arrived by telegraph. 2 Americans, Cook and Peary, both claimed they had reached the North Pole. The prize was gone. Amundsen was devastated. He was deeply in debt, and he knew that nobody would pay to see a man go to a place that had already been discovered. In a split second, he made a secret, ruthless decision. He didn't tell his investors. He didn't tell the King of Norway. He didn't even tell his own crew. He quietly changed his plans. He was not going north. He was going south to steal the prize from the British. The deception was absolute. Amundsen sailed his ship, the Fram, out of Norway in August 1910. The world, the press, and even his own crew believed they were heading for the North Pole. But as the ship sailed south through the Atlantic, the crew started to wonder. They were sailing toward the equator, which was the long way around to get to the Arctic. When they reached the island of Madeira off the coast of Africa, the air was hot and humid, a stark contrast to the ice they were used to. It was here, in the sweltering heat, that Amundsen finally gathered his men on the deck. He looked at them and dropped the mask. He told them the truth. The North Pole was gone. They had no money to pay their debts. He told them that there was only one way to save the expedition and their honor. They had to turn right, head south, and win the race to the last great prize on Earth. The crew was silent for a moment. These were tough, hardened sailors and skiers. They realized they had been lied to for months. But then, the spirit of the Vikings took over. They didn't mutiny, they cheered. They were racers at heart, and the idea of snatching the prize from the British Empire was thrilling to them. They agreed to follow him to the bottom of the world. But Amundsen had one last thing to do. He had to tell his rival. Robert Falcon Scott was currently in Melbourne, Australia, enjoying dinners and raising money for what he thought was a scientific expedition. He was relaxed. He believed he had the continent to himself. Then, a telegram arrived. It was short, polite, and devastating. It read simply, "Beg to inform you, from preceding Antarctica Amundsen." The message hit Scott like a physical blow. The gentleman's game was over. The scientific expedition was now a desperate race against a man who had no interest in rocks or penguins, but only in speed. Scott looked at his heavy ships, his ponies, and his scientific equipment, and he realized he was already behind. The race had begun before he even set foot on the ice. Chapter 2. The race to the South Pole was not really a battle between 2 men. It was a battle between 2 completely different ways of thinking. To understand why one team lived and the other perished, you have to look at where they went to school. Robert Falcon Scott went to the school of the British Royal Navy. He believed in discipline, hierarchy, and technology. He thought the best way to conquer the ice was with complex machines and sheer human grit. He believed that struggling against the elements was noble. In the British view, pulling a sled with your own muscles was heroic work. It showed character. Using dogs was seen as unreliable and perhaps a bit unsporting, like hunting a fox with a machine gun. Roald Amundsen went to a very different school. He spent 2 winters living with the Inuit people in the frozen Canadian Arctic. He didn't want to conquer nature. He wanted to live within it. The Inuit taught him lessons that the British Navy did not know. They taught him that in the polar cold, sweat is death. If you wear heavy wool coats like the British did, you sweat when you work hard. That sweat freezes inside the fabric, turning your clothes into a suit of ice that sucks the heat right out of your body. So Amundsen ignored the modern British fashion. He dressed his men in loose-fitting reindeer skins and wolf fur, just like the Inuit. These clothes breathed. They kept the men warm but dry. While Scott's men were shivering in stiff, frozen canvas and wool, Amundsen's men were comfortable. But the biggest difference was the engine. Amundsen bet everything on dogs. He brought nearly 100 Greenland sled dogs. These animals were born in the snow. They slept outside in storms, curled up in balls, letting the snow cover them like a blanket. They loved to pull. They were fast, efficient, and they ate a simple diet of dried meat. Amundsen treated his dogs not as pets, but as a vital machine. He calculated exactly how much food they needed to get him to the pole. He realized that the dogs did the work, so the men could save their energy for survival. Scott, on the other hand, made a choice that seems baffling today. He decided to bring ponies. He bought white Siberian ponies and shipped them all the way to Antarctica. He believed they could haul heavy loads. But ponies are heavy animals with small hooves. They were built for grassy plains, not deep snow. Anyone who has walked in deep snow knows that if you are heavy and have small feet, you sink. Scott also brought something brand new. Motorized sledges. They were primitive snowmobiles with tracks. He was betting that British industrial technology would beat the ancient wisdom of the dog sled. It was a gamble of metal and hooves against fur and paws. When the two expeditions finally reached the coast of Antarctica in January 1911, the difference in their strategies moved from theory to reality. Amundsen took a massive risk with his location. He sailed his ship into the Bay of Whales, an inlet in the Great Ice Barrier. This area was actually floating on the ocean, not sitting on land. British explorers had avoided it for years, fearing the ice would break off and float away to sea, taking the camp with it. But Amundsen had studied the maps. He saw that the shape of the bay had not changed in decades. He bet his life that the ice was stuck on a hidden island beneath the water. By choosing this risky spot, he gained a massive advantage. He was starting his race 60 miles closer to the South Pole than Scott. He set up his camp, which he called Framheim. It was a masterpiece of efficiency. The Norwegians dug a complex network of tunnels and storage rooms deep under the snow. They could walk from their living quarters to the workshops and the dog pens without ever going outside into the wind. They were warm, safe, and ready. Scott set up his base, Cape Evans, on solid volcanic rock further north. It was a safer location, but getting there was a disaster. The unloading of the ship was the first sign that his technology was failing. Scott had brought 3 motor sledges. These were primitive, heavy machines with caterpillar tracks, the ancestors of modern tanks. He believed they would haul the heavy supplies across the ice, saving the horses and men. But as they were unloading one of these 3-ton metal monsters, the sea ice suddenly cracked under the weight. The men watched in horror as their most advanced machine slipped backward. It smashed through the frozen surface and sank instantly to the bottom of the ocean. It was gone before it had driven a single mile. The remaining 2 machines managed to get to the shore, but they soon broke down in the cold. The intricate metal engines were not built for the Antarctic temperatures. Within days, the mechanical hope of the British expedition was essentially scrap metal. This left Scott relying on the ponies. As soon as the animals stepped onto the snow, the problem became heartbreakingly obvious. A pony is a heavy beast with small hooves. With every step, the poor animals punched through the snow crust and sank up to their bellies. They had to struggle and lunge just to move forward. They were sweating in the freezing air, and icicles formed on their flanks. Worse, the ponies needed to eat. They required hay and oats, heavy bags of food that had to be carried on the sleds. This meant the ponies were mostly hauling their own food, not the supplies for the men. Scott watched his struggling animals and his broken machines. And for the first time, a shadow of doubt must have crossed his mind. 60 miles to the south, Amundsen's dogs were running effortlessly over the top of the snow, eating lightweight dried meat, and getting stronger every day. The race had barely started, and the British plan was already sinking into the white landscape. Chapter 3. Before the sun set for the long Antarctic winter, both teams had one crucial job to do. They had to travel south and bury huge piles of food and fuel along the route. These depots would be their lifelines during the actual race, the following spring. Without them, they would starve on the return journey. It was a practice run, and it revealed exactly how the race was going to go. Amundsen went first. On February 10, 1911, he harnessed his dogs and took off. The performance was spectacular. The dogs, happy to be off the ship, pulled the sleds at a dazzling speed. The Norwegians actually had to sit on the sleds to keep from getting left behind. They treated the depot run like a sport. They laughed, they skied, and they covered ground effortlessly. Amundsen was obsessed with navigation. He knew that finding a small pile of boxes in a white blizzard was nearly impossible. So, he didn't just leave a flag. He marked his depots with a brilliant system. He used dried fish painted black. He stuck them in the snow every mile for 5 miles on either side of the depot. This created a massive 10-mile wide fence across the ice. If he hit anywhere near the target, he would see the black markers against the white snow. He laid down 3 massive depots, filled with seals, meat, and supplies, pushing far into the south. He returned to base with his team healthy, his dogs fatter than when they left, and his confidence sky high. Scott's depot journey, by contrast, was a funeral march. He set out with his ponies, but the weather turned bad almost immediately. A blizzard struck, dropping the temperature and blinding the men. The ponies, already struggling in the soft snow, began to fail. Their heavy coats became matted with ice. They refused to eat. They simply stood in the wind, shivering until they collapsed. Scott watched his animals suffering and faced a terrible decision. He had planned to place his largest supply cache, which they called 1-ton depot, at the 80th parallel. This was a specific spot on the map that would ensure they had enough food for the final leg home. But with the ponies failing and the cold biting, Scott was afraid. He didn't want to push the animals to their death just yet, so he made a choice that seemed small at the time but would echo through history. He decided to stop. He ordered the men to build 1-ton depot right where they were, 30 miles short of the planned location. He prioritized saving the ponies for the next season over the precise location of the supplies. The men built the mound of snow, planted a single flag, and turned back. Those 30 miles didn't seem like much in a journey of 1,600 miles. But Scott had just placed the safety net 30 miles further away from the finish line. As the British team stumbled back to their base for the winter, the surviving ponies were in such bad shape that they had to be put down. The technology had failed, the animals had failed, and now, the map itself was working against them. The decision to build 1-ton depot 30 miles north of its intended location was a surrender to the elements, but the tragedy of the ponies was not over. On the return journey to the main base, disaster struck. The British team was crossing the sea ice near the coast when the weather suddenly warmed. The solid white sheet beneath their feet began to groan and crack. In a terrifying few minutes, the ice broke apart. Scott and his men found themselves drifting on small floating islands of ice. Separated from each other by lanes of black freezing water, the ponies were terrified. They slipped and panicked on the moving ice. To make the situation worse, a pod of killer whales appeared in the gaps between the floes. The whales sensed the distress of the animals. They poked their heads out of the water, eyeing the ponies, waiting for them to fall in. Scott and his men spent a sleepless, desperate night, jumping from one piece of ice to another, trying to guide the frightened horses to the safety of the solid ice shelf. It was a chaotic rescue mission. In the end, they managed to save most of the equipment, but the strongest ponies were lost. They fell into the freezing water and could not be pulled out. The men watched helplessly as their engines were swallowed by the sea. By the time the team limped back to Cape Evans, the truth was undeniable. The ponies were a failure. They couldn't stand the cold, they couldn't walk on the snow, and they were a danger on the sea ice. Scott had bet his expedition on these animals, and they were dying before the real race had even begun. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the south, the contrast could not have been sharper. Amundsen's dogs were thriving. They had run hundreds of miles to lay their depots and returned to base heavier and healthier than when they left. They dug holes in the snow and slept warmly through the blizzards. They didn't need shoes, blankets, or oats. They were perfectly adapted to the environment. While Scott was mourning the loss of his transport, Amundsen was watching his dogs play in the snow, knowing that his engines were ready for the spring. The sun was setting for the long winter night, and the British team entered the darkness with doubt in their hearts, while the Norwegians entered it with the confidence of professionals. Chapter 4. In late April 1911, the sun dipped below the horizon and did not come back. For 4 months, the two expeditions were locked in a prison of total darkness. The Antarctic winter is not just cold, it is a psychological crusher. Outside the wooden huts, the wind screamed at 70 miles per hour, and the temperature dropped so low that the mercury froze solid inside the thermometers. The only light came from the moon, the swirling southern auroras, and the warm yellow glow of the seal blubber lamps inside the huts. Inside Amundsen's camp, Framheim, the atmosphere was intense. Amundsen wasn't resting, he was worrying. He had learned a terrifying lesson on his practice run. His sledges were too heavy. He realized that if he didn't fix them, the dogs would exhaust themselves before they reached the pole. So, he turned his winter quarters into a factory. The underground rooms smelled of sawdust, leather, and sweat. Amundsen ordered his master carpenter, Olav Bjaaland, to take the sledges apart piece by piece. Bjaaland was a genius with wood. He shaved off every ounce of unnecessary timber. He drilled holes in the runners to make them lighter. He replaced heavy metal fittings with light lashings. Amundsen was obsessed with weight. He knew that every single ounce the dogs had to pull would cost energy, and energy meant food. He even ordered the men to unpack their food crates and shave the wood off the boxes. By the time the sun was ready to return, the Norwegians had reduced the weight of their equipment by nearly 100 pounds per sledge without losing any strength. While the blizzard raged outside, the Vikings were sharpening their weapons, preparing to move faster than anyone thought possible. While Amundsen's camp felt like a busy workshop, Scott's base at Cape Evans felt like a university library. The British hut was huge, comfortable, and strictly organized. It was divided by a wall of packing crates. On one side were the officers and scientists, on the other side were the enlisted seamen. Even at the bottom of the world, the British class system remained perfectly intact. The atmosphere inside was civilized and intellectual. To keep morale up during the endless darkness, Scott organized a series of lectures. 3 nights a week, the men would gather to hear talks about the geology of volcanoes, the parasites of fish, or the history of the Antarctic. They played a player piano, smoked pipes, and debated science late into the night. It was a scene of remarkable comfort. Outside, the temperature was 40 degrees below zero, but inside, they were drinking hot cocoa and discussing the age of the Earth. Scott believed that this mental discipline was just as important as physical training. He wrote in his diary about how proud he was of his gentlemen. He saw their calm academic routine as proof that they were superior to the raw elements outside. They were conquering the continent with their minds. But there was a dangerous silence in the British camp. While the Norwegians were shaving ounces off their sledges and sewing new boots, the British equipment largely sat untouched. They were trusting the gear they brought with them. They were relying on the plan they had made in London. They weren't adapting to the reality of the ice. They were trying to impose their routine upon it. As the winter dragged on, the sun began its slow return. The darkness turned to a gray twilight. The winter night was ending. Both teams knew that as soon as the sun peaked above the horizon, the race would truly begin. But the first move would not be a triumph. It would be a near-fatal mistake born of panic. Amundsen, usually so cool and calculated, was about to let his fear of the British drive him to make a reckless decision that almost destroyed his entire expedition. Chapter 5. The sun finally rose on September 8, 1911, ending the long night, but it brought no warmth. The temperature outside was hovering around 56 degrees below 0 Celsius. It was a cold so intense that the liquid in the compasses froze solid, and a bottle of gin turned into a block of slush. In these conditions, travel is usually considered suicidal, but Roald Amundsen was not thinking clearly. He was gripped by a sudden, overwhelming paranoia. He couldn't see the British camp 60 miles away, but in his mind, he imagined Scott's motor sledges roaring across the ice. He was terrified that the British machines were already halfway to the pole while he was sitting still. He convinced himself that he had to leave immediately, regardless of the temperature. It was a disastrous decision. The Norwegians harnessed the dogs and set off into the white fog. Almost immediately, the expedition began to fall apart. The cold was a physical weapon. The dogs, usually so tough, could not breathe properly in the freezing air. Their paws cracked and bled on the hard ice. The men, dressed in their furs, could keep their bodies warm, but they couldn't protect their faces. Frostbite attacked them within hours. They managed to reach their first depot, but they realized they could go no further. The liquid in their fuel cans was freezing. The dogs were lying down in the snow, refusing to get up. Amundsen realized he had made a terrible mistake. If they continued, they would all die before they reached the mountain range. He gave the order to turn around and race back to the safety of Framheim. The retreat was chaotic. Amundsen, usually a leader who stayed at the back to ensure everyone was safe, panicked. He jumped on the first sled and raced ahead, terrified of being caught out in the open during the night. He arrived back at the base hours before the rest of his men. The last two men, Johansen and Prestrud, were left behind in the dark, struggling through a blizzard with no tent and fuel that wouldn't burn. They barely survived the march back, stumbling into the camp hours later, frostbitten, exhausted, and furious. The false start had shattered the unity of the group. For the first time, the men looked at their leader not as an infallible Viking, but as a man whose panic nearly killed them. The mood in the camp was toxic, but they had learned a lesson that would save their lives. You cannot force the Antarctic. You must wait for the spring. The morning after the chaotic retreat, the atmosphere inside the Norwegian hut was toxic. The men sat around the breakfast table in silence. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and pipe smoke, but nobody was speaking. They were all looking at Hjalmar Johansen. Johansen was not just a regular crew member, he was a legend in Norway. He had explored the Arctic years earlier, with the famous hero Nansen. He was older, tougher, and more experienced than Amundsen, and he was furious. He had nearly died the night before because his leader Amundsen had panicked and raced home, leaving his men behind in the dark. Johansen stood up at the table and did the unthinkable. He challenged Amundsen in front of the entire crew. He spoke with a quiet, burning anger. He told Amundsen that what happened yesterday was not an expedition, it was a panic. He said that a leader should never abandon his men. It was a stinging insult. The other men stared at their plates, terrified. In the world of polar exploration, this was mutiny. Amundsen sat frozen. He knew Johansen was right. He had panicked, but he also knew that if he let Johansen speak to him like that, he would lose control of the expedition. The race to the pole required absolute obedience. He realized he had to crush the rebellion immediately. He didn't yell, he didn't argue. He waited until the afternoon, and then he issued a cold, ruthless order. He kicked Johansen off the polar team. It was a humiliating punishment. Johansen, the best skier and the toughest man on the team, was told he would not be going to the South Pole. Instead, he was ordered to go on a minor, meaningless mapping trip to the coast under the command of a junior officer. Amundsen reduced the polar team from 8 men to 5. He removed anyone who questioned him. The message was clear to everyone left in the room. Amundsen was not there to make friends. He was there to win. If you stood in his way, or if you questioned his judgment, you were gone. The incident destroyed Johansen's spirit, but it restored discipline to the group. When the weather finally cleared for the second attempt, the 5 remaining men followed Amundsen with total, fearful obedience. They were terrified of the cold, but they were also terrified of failing their leader. The team was smaller, but it was now a single, sharpened weapon ready to strike at the heart of the continent. Chapter 6. On October 19, 1911, the weather finally broke. The birds returned to the coast, signaling that spring had truly arrived. Amundsen didn't hesitate. He gathered his men, now reduced to a tight team of 5, and harnessed 52 dogs. This time, there was no panic. There was only quiet, professional efficiency. They moved across the ice like a train. The dogs, rested and eager, pulled the sledges so fast that the men didn't even have to ski. They could hold on to the sledges and be towed along. They covered 15, then 20 miles a day without breaking a sweat. It felt less like a desperate struggle for survival and more like a high-speed holiday. They reached their depots easily, fed the dogs ample seal meat, and pushed deeper into the unknown. The journey was so smooth that one of the men wrote in his diary that it was a pleasure trip. 11 days later, on November 1st, Robert Falcon Scott finally launched his bid for the pole. The contrast was painful to watch. Scott sent his motorized sledges out first. He placed his immense hope in these machines. He believed that the roar of the engines would herald a new age of British industrial dominance in the Antarctic. But the machines were doomed from the first mile. As they crunched over the rough ice, the vibrations shook them apart. The extreme cold caused the metal cylinders to crack. One by one, the engines sputtered and died. The mechanics tried desperately to fix them in the freezing wind, burning their fingers on the cold metal, but it was hopeless. Just a few miles from the base, the expensive, heavy machines became useless junk. The men had to unload the supplies and drag the heavy sledges themselves. They hadn't even left the site of their own camp, and already, the British team was exhausted. They were relying on the ponies now, trudging slowly behind Amundsen, who was already disappearing over the horizon. The technology had failed completely. The British expedition was no longer a mechanized conquest. It was a slow, brutal march of flesh and blood against the ice. While Amundsen's team was racing toward the mountains, Scott's expedition was slowly turning into a tragedy. The motorized sledges were already abandoned scrap metal. Now, the ponies were failing. As the British team approached the massive Beardmore Glacier, the gateway to the polar plateau, the animals were completely exhausted. They had struggled through deep, soft snow for weeks. Their food was gone. They were stumbling, weak, and shivering constantly. At the foot of the glacier, Scott made the grim decision he had been dreading. The ponies could not climb the mountain. They had to be put down. The men built a camp they named Shambles Camp. It was a sad, quiet day. The animals that had been their companions for months were sacrificed. Their meat was stored as food for the return journey. From this moment on, the nature of the British expedition changed completely. There were no motors, there were no ponies. There were only men. Scott believed in a concept called man-hauling. He thought it was the purest, most noble way to reach the pole. The men stepped into leather harnesses, tied ropes to the heavy wooden sledges, and began to pull. Each sledge weighed hundreds of pounds. The men became human workhorses. They leaned forward, straining against the ropes, their boots slipping on the ice, their breath rasped in their throats. Every single mile was a physical battle that burned thousands of calories. They were starving themselves with every step, using up the energy they would desperately need later just to survive. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles ahead, Amundsen was facing his own mountain challenge. He had reached the Axel-Heiberg Glacier, a terrifyingly steep wall of ice that rose 10,000 feet into the air. But Amundsen had his dogs. The animals clawed their way up the ice, pulling the sledges with incredible power. When they reached the top of the plateau, Amundsen made a cold, calculated decision. He had started with 52 dogs. He only needed 18 to get to the pole. He selected the weakest animals and sacrificed them. He fed their meat to the remaining dogs. It was a brutal piece of mathematics, but it meant that his surviving team was fed, strong, and full of energy. While Scott's men were slowly destroying their own bodies, dragging heavy loads uphill, Amundsen's team was racing across the high plateau, lighter and faster than ever. The Viking had turned the cruel logic of survival into a winning strategy, while the Navy man was walking slowly toward his own destruction. Chapter 7. On December 14, 1911, the weather on the high polar plateau was beautiful. The sun was shining brightly, and the wind had dropped to a gentle breeze. Roald Amundsen and his 4 men were skiing silently alongside their dog teams. They were nervous. For the last few days, every time they saw a shadow on the snow or a strange formation of ice, their hearts stopped. They were terrified that it was a British cairn or a flag. They were haunted by the fear that Scott had beaten them. But the horizon remained empty. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sledge meters on the sleds clicked over to the magic number. Amundsen raised his hand and halted the dogs. They checked their sextants and the position of the sun. They were there. There was no mountain, no valley, no landmark. The bottom of the world was just a flat, endless sheet of white snow, indistinguishable from the thousands of miles they had just crossed. But they had done it. They were the first human beings to stand at the South Pole. The celebration was quiet and emotional. The 5 men Amundsen, Bjelland, Hansen, Hassel, and Wisting took the Norwegian flag. They didn't want one man to claim the glory, so all 5 of them gripped the flagpole together. They slammed it into the hard snow. The silk flag snapped in the wind, a bright splash of red and blue against the white desert. They named the spot Polheim, which means home of the pole. They spent 3 days there, taking measurements to prove exactly where they were. Before they left, Amundsen did something that was both practical and psychologically devastating. He set up a small tent. Inside, he left some spare equipment and a letter addressed to the King of Norway. He also left a note for Captain Scott. The note asked Scott a simple favor. If Amundsen and his men died on the way back, would Scott please deliver the letter to the king? It was a polite request, but it was also the ultimate sign of dominance. It meant that Amundsen was so confident Scott would arrive second that he was using the British expedition as his mail carriers. Amundsen turned his sledges north and began the race for home, leaving the tent standing like a tombstone waiting for the British to arrive. 34 days after Amundsen left the pole, a tiny black speck appeared on the white horizon. It was January 16, 1912. Robert Falcon Scott and his 4 remaining men Wilson, Oates, Bowers, and Evans were straining against their harnesses. They were starving, frostbitten, and exhausted. They had dragged their heavy sledges up the massive glacier and across the polar plateau, driven only by the desperate hope that they were still ahead of the Norwegians. One of the men, Bowers, possessed the sharpest eyes. He saw the speck first. He pointed it out to the others. At first they tried to convince themselves it was a shadow or a ridge of ice. They argued about it as they marched, desperate to believe that the horizon was empty. But as they drew closer, the shape became undeniable. It was not a rock. It was a black flag tied to a sledge runner, left by Amundsen to mark his path. The realization hit the British team with the force of a physical blow. The silence on the ice was heavy. Scott wrote in his diary that night, "The worst has happened." They had walked 900 miles, suffering unimaginable hardship, only to find out they were the losers. The dream they had carried for years evaporated in a single second. The next day they marched the final few miles to the actual pole. There they found the small tent Amundsen had left behind. It stood stark and lonely against the snow. Inside they found some equipment, a little bit of food, and the letters. Scott held the letter addressed to King Håkon of Norway. He realized the full extent of his humiliation. He was not the conqueror of the pole. He was just the first tourist. He was being asked to carry the proof of his rival's victory back to civilization. The mood of the 5 men collapsed completely. They planted their Union Jack flag, but it felt hollow. The wind whipped around them, the temperature hovering at 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. They took a grainy photograph, their faces black with frostbite, their eyes hollow and staring. There were no smiles. Scott looked at the bleak, empty landscape that had cost him everything, and wrote the most famous, tragic line in Antarctic history. "Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." They turned their backs on the pole and faced north. They had to walk 800 miles back to their base. But they were different men now. They were broken. They had no victory to keep them warm, no glory to fuel their steps. They were just 5 tired men dragging a heavy load into the teeth of the approaching winter, and they were already running out of time. Chapter 8. The march back from the pole was a race against the season. Scott and his men knew that the Antarctic summer was ending. They had to travel 800 miles to reach the safety of their main base before the temperatures dropped to fatal levels. But they were already in trouble. The physical toll of man-hauling the sledges was catching up to them. They were burning more than 6,000 calories a day, but their rations only provided about 4,000. They were slowly starving. Their bodies began to consume their own muscle for energy. The first man to break was Petty Officer Edgar Evans. He had been the strongest man on the team, a giant of a sailor who had helped load the sledges with ease. But on the way down the massive Beardmore Glacier, he fell and suffered a concussion. He began to lose his mind. He mumbled incoherently, stopped marching, and eventually collapsed. He died at the foot of the glacier in February. The team was now down to 4 men, and they were shaken. They had lost their strongest engine. As they reached the flat barrier ice, where they expected easier travel, the weather turned against them. The temperatures plummeted unexpectedly early. It dropped to 40 degrees below 0 during the day. At these temperatures, the snow on the ground changed its physical properties. It stopped being slippery. It became like dry sand or sandpaper. The sledges, which should have glided, felt like they were being dragged over concrete. The men had to pull with every ounce of their remaining strength just to move forward a few miles a day. Then, Captain Lawrence Oates began to fail. He was an Army cavalry officer, a tough man who never complained, but his feet were severely frostbitten. They had swollen to the size of footballs and turned black. Every step was agony. He knew that he was slowing the team down. They were falling behind schedule, and the next food depot was still miles away. On the night of March 16th, a massive blizzard struck. The wind screamed outside the thin canvas tent, trapping them inside. Oates listened to the wind and looked at his friends. He knew that if they had to drag him, they would all die. He made a decision that became legendary in British history. He struggled to his feet and turned to the door of the tent. He looked at Scott and said calmly, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He stepped out into the white darkness and the swirling snow. He was never seen again. He had sacrificed himself walking to his death to give his friends a chance to survive. It was an act of supreme bravery, but tragically, it was not enough to save them. The three remaining men, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, pushed on, but the cold was closing in. After Oates walked into the blizzard, the three remaining men, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers, managed to struggle forward for a few more days. They were weak, their feet were frozen, and they had almost no fuel left to melt snow for water. They were dehydrated and starving, but they knew exactly where they were going. They were heading for 1-ton depot. This was the massive supply cache they had built the previous year. It was filled with food, fuel, and supplies. It was their salvation. They checked their maps. They were only 11 miles away. For healthy men, 11 miles is a short morning walk. Even in their condition, it was perhaps 2 days of marching. They could almost feel the safety waiting for them just over the horizon. But then, the final blow fell. On March 21st, a massive blizzard struck. The wind howled at 60 miles per hour, and the snow filled the air so thickly that they could unsee a foot in front of their faces. They pitched their small tent and waited for the storm to pass. They waited 1 day, then 2, then 3. The storm did not stop. It raged for over a week. Inside the tent, the temperature was freezing. They had used the last of their fuel to make a final cup of tea. Now, they just lay in their sleeping bags, listening to the wind that was keeping them from the food that would save their lives. It was here that the tragedy of Chapter 3 came back to haunt them. If Scott had pushed his ponies, those extra 30 miles the year before, 1-ton depot would have been behind them by now. They would have already reached it. The decision to stop early had cost them exactly the distance they now could not cover. Scott realized that they were not going to leave the tent. He spent his final hours writing. He wrote letters to the wives of his men, to his own wife, and to the British public. His handwriting was steady and calm. He didn't write about fear. He wrote about pride. He wrote, "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint." The last entry in his diary was dated March 29, 1912. It ended with a simple plea. "For God's sake, look after our people." Then, the pen dropped. The three men went to sleep and never woke up. 8 months later, a search party found the tent. It was almost buried in snow, looking like a small white mound in the vast desert. When they dug it out, they found the men frozen in their sleeping bags. They found the diaries, the letters, and the camera. They also found something that spoke to the incredible discipline of the British team. On the sledge outside the tent were 35 pounds of geological rocks they had dragged from the mountains. Even as they were dying, they refused to abandon their scientific specimens. The search party did not move the boaties. They collapsed the tent over the men, building a cairn of snow on top to mark the spot. They fashioned a cross from a pair of skis. It was a white tomb for the three heroes. Left alone in the middle of the ice shelf, Amundsen had won the race. He was the first, but Scott's tragedy captured the imagination of the world. His journals were published, and his story of struggle and stoicism became a legend. The race to the end of the world was over. It proved that in the most hostile place on Earth, courage is essential, but preparation is survival. The Antarctic does not forgive mistakes, and the distance between glory and a frozen grave is often just 11 miles.